He thought inviting her would entertain the room, but he had no idea he was about to dismantle his own reputation in front of everyone watching. Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd really appreciate your support. Take a quick moment to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. It's completely free and helps us keep bringing you more powerful and emotional content. Also, I'd love to know where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thanks so much for being here. The grand ballroom of the Manhattan Chess Club shimmered under warm golden lights, polished marble floors reflecting rows of spectators dressed in tailored suits and elegant evening wear, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation as cameras lined the edges of the hall, all focused on one man, Victor Langston, the undefeated Grandmaster whose name alone carried weight across continents. A man who hadn't lost a single official match in over 7 years. No, not just for his brilliance, but for the quiet arrogance that followed him like a shadow. And tonight, he was putting on a show, not just a game, but a performance designed to remind everyone exactly who he was and who they were not. His eyes scanning the room with calculated amusement before landing on someone no one else had bothered to notice, a woman standing near the far wall in a simple blue maintenance uniform, holding a cleaning cloth, her presence almost invisible against the grandeur of the room. Clara Whitmore, a name no one there knew, a woman most had already dismissed without a second glance, and yet Victor's lips curled slightly as he raised his hand and pointed directly at her, the room following his gesture in confusion before soft laughter began to ripple through the crowd. "You," he said, his voice calm but laced with something unmistakable. "Why don't you join me for a quick game?" A pause, just long enough for the implication to settle, for the audience to recognize the setup. The imbalance, the quiet humiliation unfolding in real time. A grandmaster versus a janitor, not a competition, but a spectacle, a joke. Phones lifted instantly, whispers spreading like wildfire, some amused, others curious, a few already anticipating the inevitable embarrassment. Clara didn't react at first. Her posture still, her expression unreadable, as if she hadn't even heard him, or perhaps as if she had heard something entirely different, something beneath the surface of his words, something only she understood. Victor leaned back slightly, tapping the chessboard in front of him, the polished wooden pieces already arranged, waiting. "Come on," he added with a faint smile. "It'll be quick." More laughter, sharper this time, more confident, the kind that comes when people believe they already know how a story ends. And slowly, almost quietly, Clara stepped forward, each footstep soft against the marble floor, her presence growing with every inch she moved, though no one could quite explain why. Her eyes steady, not defiant, not nervous, just certain. And in that moment, though no one noticed it yet, something in the room shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the air before a storm. Victor gestured to the chair across from him, his confidence unwavering, already imagining the applause, the easy victory, the reminder to everyone watching that greatness wasn't something you could simply walk into. Clara sat down without a word, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the board, and for the first time that evening, Victor looked at her not as part of the background, but as something else entirely, something he couldn't quite define. And somewhere in the silence that followed, before the first move was even made, the outcome had already begun to change. Victor Langston rested his fingers lightly on the edge of the chessboard, his confidence still intact, but there was a subtle shift now, something almost imperceptible in the way his eyes lingered on Clara Whitmore just a fraction longer than before, as if trying to understand why she did not look nervous, why she did not fidget or glance at the crowd or show even the smallest sign of hesitation, because that was what he expected. That was what everyone expected, yet Clara simply sat there, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady on the board, as though the hundreds of eyes watching them did not exist, as though the whispers circling the room were nothing more than distant noise. And that quiet composure began to stir a faint unease beneath Victor's practiced calm, though he quickly dismissed it with a faint smirk, because in his world, doubt was something reserved for other people, not for him, not for a man who had built his name on precision and control. And so he reached forward and made the first move, a classic opening, deliberate and confident, the kind that signaled both dominance and predictability. A move designed not just to begin the game, but to establish authority, to remind everyone watching exactly who was in control. A few spectators nodded approvingly, recognizing the opening, murmuring quietly to one another about how quickly this would be over, how this was already decided, before it had even begun. And yet Clara responded almost instantly, her hand moving without hesitation, placing her piece with a quiet, almost effortless precision that did not match the narrative unfolding around her. And for the briefest moment, Victor's expression flickered, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it, a tiny disruption in the rhythm he was used to controlling. He leaned back slightly, studying the board again, telling himself it meant nothing, that anyone could make a quick response on the first move, that it did not require skill, only instinct. But as he leaned forward again for his second move, there was a fraction more calculation in his eyes, a fraction more attention than he had intended to give, and the room, still filled with low laughter and quiet commentary, had not yet realized that something had already begun to shift. Clara's second move came just as quickly, just as precise, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged, and now a few of the more experienced players in the crowd began to exchange glances, subtle at first, barely noticeable, but there was something in the pattern forming on the board that did not quite align with the expected flow of a casual, one-sided game. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he made his third move, slightly faster than before, as if to reassert control, as if to push the game back into the predictable path he had envisioned. But Clara's response came again without delay, and this time, there was no mistaking it. The rhythm of the game had changed, the balance had shifted, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to disturb the illusion of inevitability that had filled the room only moments ago. The laughter began to fade, replaced by a quieter, more focused silence, phones still held in the air, but now steadier, as if the people recording sensed that what they were capturing was no longer just a joke. Victor leaned forward, his attention fully locked onto the board now, his earlier arrogance softening into something sharper, more alert, because for the first time in a long time, he could not immediately see the end of the game, and that uncertainty, small as it was, began to spread through him like a hairline crack in glass. Clara, meanwhile, remained exactly the same, her breathing even, her eyes calm, her presence grounded in a way that did not seek attention and yet commanded it. And somewhere in the growing silence of that grand hall, between the careful placement of pieces and the quiet tension building with every move, a realization began to take shape, slow but undeniable, that this was no longer a performance, no longer a harmless spectacle, but something far more dangerous to Victor Langston than anyone in that room had anticipated, including Victor himself. By the time Victor Langston reached for his fourth move, the room had already begun to feel different, though no one dared to say it out loud. The earlier laughter now replaced by a tension that settled quietly over the marble floors like a weight no one could quite shake. His fingers hovered just above the piece for a fraction too long, a hesitation so subtle that only the most trained eyes could notice. But in a room filled with seasoned players, it did not go unseen. A few brows furrowed, a few heads tilted slightly, because hesitation was not something Victor was known for, not in 7 years. Not in hundreds of matches where his confidence had always been absolute. And yet here he was, calculating more carefully than he had intended, scanning the board as if something had slipped just beyond his control, something he could not immediately name. Clara Whitmore remained still across from him, her hands resting lightly in her lap now, her gaze steady, not pressing, not provoking, simply waiting. And that stillness, that quiet patience, began to feel louder than any words spoken earlier in the room. Victor finally committed to his move, placing the piece with a controlled motion, a move that on the surface appeared solid, even strong, but beneath it carried a trace of urgency, a subtle attempt to regain the narrative he had so confidently written moments before. The piece clicked softly against the board, echoing faintly in the now near silent hall, and then, without pause, without the slightest flicker of doubt, Clara responded, her hand moving with a precision that felt almost inevitable, as if the move had already been decided long before Victor had even sat down. And that was the moment it became undeniable. A ripple passed through the crowd, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The kind of collective realization that moves through people all at once. The understanding that what they were witnessing no longer fit the story they had expected. Victor leaned forward, his posture tightening, his eyes narrowing as he traced the lines on the board again. Once, twice, 3 times, his mind racing through possibilities, searching for the path that would restore balance. But the clarity he was used to finding was not there, each variation leading to the same unsettling conclusion. A narrowing of options, a tightening of space, and for the first time in years, Victor Langston felt something he had almost forgotten. Uncertainty, not fear, not yet, but something close enough to disturb the foundation of his control. The air in the room grew heavier, phones still raised but no longer shifting, no longer capturing a joke, but documenting something far more serious. A few spectators leaned in closer, their earlier amusement replaced by focused attention. And in the reflection of the polished board, the contrast between the two players became almost symbolic. Victor, once relaxed and commanding, now rigid and calculating, and Clara, unchanged, composed, her presence grounded in a quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself, did not need validation. It simply existed, and it was in that contrast that the truth began to settle, slow and undeniable. Victor's next move came faster than his last, not out of certainty, but out of necessity. A move made to keep the game alive rather than to control it. And as his hand withdrew, there was a brief pause, a suspended moment where the entire room seemed to hold its breath, because now, whether they understood it fully or not, everyone could feel it, the edge of something irreversible. Clara looked at the board for a single second, no more, and then she moved, calm, precise, final, and as her fingers released the piece, the shift completed itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that settled into the room like truth itself. And Victor Langston, the man who had never needed more than a glance to see the end of a game, found himself staring at the board, searching, calculating, and realizing that whatever came next, it was no longer his to control. Victor Langston did not move immediately, and that alone was enough to send a quiet shock through the room. Because men like him did not pause without reason. They did not sit in silence searching for answers that should have come instinctively. Yet there he was, his eyes locked on the board, tracing lines that seemed to collapse no matter how many times he recalculated them. His mind moving faster now, pushing through variations, trying to force an opening where none appeared, and for the first time in years, the certainty that had defined him began to slip, not dramatically, but steadily, like something eroding beneath the surface. The crowd felt it too. That subtle shift from anticipation to realization. Phones still raised, but now forgotten in steady hands. No one whispering anymore. No one laughing. Just watching, waiting, because something irreversible was unfolding in front of them. Clara Whitmore remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, her posture composed, her expression calm, her presence almost detached from the tension filling the room, as if she were not reacting to Victor at all, but simply following a path she had already seen long before any of them understood it. Victor finally reached forward, his movement slower now, more deliberate, as he placed his next piece, a move that would have once carried confidence, but now held only necessity. An attempt to delay what he could no longer prevent. The piece touched the board with a faint click. And in that sound there was something final, something that marked the end of control rather than the continuation of it. A few experienced players in the audience exchanged glances, subtle but unmistakable, because they could see it clearly now, the narrowing position, the closing net, the quiet inevitability of what was coming. Though none of them dared to say it out loud, Clara looked down at the board, her gaze steady, and for a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, her eyes softened, not with hesitation, but with recognition, as if she had reached a point she had expected all along. Her hand moved, smooth and precise, guiding her piece into place without flourish, without hesitation, and as her fingers released it, the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Victor's body went still, completely still, his eyes fixed on the board as the realization settled in, slow but undeniable. His options were gone. Every line he traced led to the same end. Every possibility closed before it could begin. The undefeated Grandmaster, the man who had built his legacy on foresight and control, now faced a position he could not escape. The silence in the room deepened, heavy and complete, as if even the air had paused to witness the moment. No one moved. No one spoke, because they all felt it now. The shift from disbelief to understanding. Clara had not stumbled into this. She had not been lucky. This was intention. This was mastery, and Victor knew it. His fingers hovered slightly above the board. But this time, there was no move to make, no calculation left to perform. Only the quiet acceptance of something he had never expected to experience in this room, in front of this audience, from someone he had dismissed without a second thought. His hand slowly lowered, not to move a piece, but to rest against the table, a small, controlled motion that carried more weight than any dramatic reaction ever could. And in that stillness, the truth became undeniable to everyone watching. The game was no longer his, and perhaps it never had been. And as the realization settled fully into Victor Langston's expression, the room remained silent, because there are moments when applause feels too small, and this was one of them. Victor Langston did not need to say the words for everyone to understand them, because the board spoke with a clarity no explanation could soften. His king stood trapped, every square taken, every escape sealed with a precision that left no room for argument, no room for pride. And in that moment, the man who had spent years controlling outcomes found himself facing the one thing he had always denied others: inevitability. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came, because there was nothing to defend, nothing to challenge, only the quiet truth resting between carved pieces of wood. And across from him, Clara Whitmore simply sat, her hands now folded gently in her lap, her expression unchanged, not triumphant, not mocking, just steady, as though the result had never been in question. The silence in the room deepened, stretching longer than anyone expected, because applause required movement, and no one seemed ready to move. Not yet. Not while the weight of what had just happened continued to settle over them. A Grandmaster defeated in a matter of moments. Not by another titled player, not by a rival with a reputation, but by someone they had all overlooked, someone they had already decided did not belong at that table. Victor finally exhaled, slow and controlled, his shoulders lowering slightly as the realization fully took hold. He leaned back just enough to create space between himself and the board, as if distance might somehow change what he was seeing, but it did not. The position remained the same, undeniable, complete. And for the first time in a very long time, Victor Langston nodded, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but filled with meaning, a silent acknowledgement of something he could not ignore. The room remained still, watching him, waiting for some kind of reaction, something dramatic, something to release the tension that had built so quietly. But Victor did not give them that. Instead, he looked at Clara, really looked at her this time, not as a background figure, not as a mistake in his evening's entertainment, but as someone who had just revealed a truth he had failed to see. And in his eyes, there was no anger, no denial, only a quiet recognition that what had happened was real. Clara met his gaze for a brief moment, her eyes calm, grounded, and in that shared silence, something passed between them that the rest of the room could not fully understand. Not words, not explanation, just recognition. Victor's hand moved slowly across the table, not to change the board, not to correct anything, but simply to rest beside it, a gesture of closure, of acceptance. And still, Clara did not speak. She did not explain herself, did not offer justification or story, because none was needed. The board had already said everything. And that was when it happened. Not a burst of applause, not a loud reaction, but a quiet shift. One person lowering their phone, then another, a few glances exchanged, subtle nods from those who understood what they had just witnessed on a deeper level. Not just a game, but a reminder. Victor leaned forward slightly once more, his voice finally breaking the silence. Not loud, not commanding, but measured, controlled. How long? He began, then paused, as if realizing the question itself did not matter, because whatever answer she gave would not change what had just happened. He stopped, the words fading before they could fully form, and Clara, after a moment, stood, her movements as simple and unassuming as When she had first walked forward, she gave a small, respectful nod, nothing more, then turned, stepping away from the table, away from the board, away from the crowd that now watched her with something entirely different than before, not amusement, not dismissal, but quiet respect. And as she moved back toward the edge of the room, returning to the place where she had once been invisible, the silence followed her, not empty this time, but full, filled with the understanding that some stories do not need explanation, only witness. And behind her, Victor Langston remained seated, his eyes still on the board, not searching anymore, not calculating, just looking, because sometimes the most powerful lesson is the one that leaves nothing left to say. And in that stillness, the room finally understood what mastery truly looks like. The room did not return to normal after Clara Whitmore walked away, because something about what had just happened refused to settle into memory as just another moment. It lingered, heavy and unresolved, like a question no one knew how to ask out loud. Victor Langston remained seated at the table, his eyes still fixed on the board, not because he did not understand what had happened, but because he understood it too clearly, every move replaying in his mind with a precision that left no room for denial. 5 moves. That was all it had taken, not a fluke, not a mistake, but a sequence so clean, so deliberate, that it could only come from someone who had seen the entire path before it even began. His fingers traced lightly along the edge of the table, a quiet habit of calculation. Except now there was nothing left to calculate, only to acknowledge. Around him, the crowd began to shift slowly, not in the loud, reactive way that usually followed a match, but in quiet, thoughtful movements, people lowering their phones, exchanging glances that carried more meaning than words, because what they had witnessed did not fit into the comfortable categories they were used to. It was not just an upset. It was something deeper, something that challenged the way they had looked at the woman in the blue uniform just minutes earlier, and that realization settled uneasily in many of them. Victor finally stood, the movement controlled, deliberate, his posture still composed, but no longer carrying the same effortless authority. There was something more grounded now, something quieter. He turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room, not searching for applause, not seeking validation, but looking for one person, Clara Whitmore, and it did not take long to find her. She was back near the edge of the room, exactly where she had been before, her presence once again blending into the background, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred, as if she had simply returned to her place in the world without needing recognition. Victor took a step forward, then another, the soft sound of his shoes against marble echoing faintly in the lingering silence. A few people noticed, their attention shifting as he moved, but no one interrupted, no one spoke, because something about this moment demanded space. When he reached her, he stopped a few feet away, not too close, not imposing, just present. Clara looked up at him, her expression calm, the same quiet steadiness that had defined her from the beginning. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because whatever needed to be said did not belong to words spoken quickly or carelessly. Victor inclined his head slightly, a gesture small in motion but immense in meaning. "That was not luck," he said, his voice low, measured, stripped of the edge it had carried earlier. Clara did not smile, did not deflect. She simply met his gaze, and in that silence, the truth of his statement stood on its own. Victor exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had held onto for years. "I have played thousands of games," he continued, "and I have never seen that sequence before." His eyes searched hers, not with challenge, but with genuine curiosity now, the kind that comes when certainty has been replaced by respect. Clara's response was quiet, almost gentle. "Most people are not looking for it," she said, her voice steady, without pride, without performance, just a simple statement of fact. And something in those words settled into the space between them, deeper than explanation, deeper than recognition. Victor nodded again, slower this time, as if absorbing not just her words, but everything that had led to them. Around them, the room remained still, watching, not intruding, because this was no longer about the spectacle of a match. It was about something quieter, something more lasting. Clara adjusted the cloth in her hand, slightly, a small, ordinary movement that contrasted with the extraordinary moment that had just passed. And then, Without ceremony, without announcement, she stepped back, returning fully to her role, her place, her quiet presence at the edge of the room. And Victor Langston, for the first time in years, did not try to control what came next, because some lessons are not meant to be controlled, only understood. And as he stood there, watching her disappear once more into the background, the room around him remained silent, not out of shock anymore, but out of respect, because something fundamental had shifted, not just on the board, but in every person who had witnessed it, and that kind of change does not need noise to be real. The quiet did not fade after their brief exchange. It deepened, settling into the walls of the grand hall as if the building itself had absorbed what had just taken place. And though conversations slowly began to return, they were softer now, measured, as if everyone instinctively understood that something ordinary had been replaced by something far more significant. Victor Langston remained where he stood for a moment longer, his gaze following Clara Whitmore as she moved back into the rhythm of her work, her presence once again blending into the background. And yet it was no longer the same invisibility, because now people saw her, truly saw her, not as part of the setting, but as someone who had just rewritten the assumptions they carried without question. A few spectators glanced toward her, their expressions no longer amused or dismissive, but thoughtful, even humbled, and in those glances, a quiet shift in perspective began to take hold. Victor turned slowly, walking back toward the chessboard, each step deliberate, not with the intention of reclaiming control, but with the quiet purpose of understanding what he had just experienced. He stopped at the table and looked down at the pieces once more, not as tools of dominance, but as elements of a lesson he had not expected to learn tonight. His hand hovered briefly over the board, then withdrew, because there was nothing to adjust, nothing to replay that would change the outcome. Only the recognition of precision that had surpassed his own. Around him, a few of the more experienced players began to approach cautiously. Drawn not by curiosity alone, but by respect, they studied the position silently, their eyes moving across the board, retracing the sequence that had led to this moment, and one by one, their expressions shifted, subtle nods, quiet acknowledgments, because they understood what many others could not yet fully grasp. This had not been a coincidence. It had been mastery, pure and undeniable. Victor noticed their reactions, but he did not speak, because he did not need to. The board spoke clearly enough, and in that clarity, his role in the moment changed, no longer the center of admiration, but a witness to something greater than his own reputation. Across the room, Clara continued her work, her movements steady, unhurried, as if the events of the evening had not altered her rhythm in the slightest. And that was perhaps the most striking detail of all. She did not linger in the attention, did not claim the moment, did not allow it to define her. Instead, she returned to what she had been doing, grounded, composed, unaffected by the shift in how others now perceived her, and that quiet consistency carried a weight that no declaration could match. Victor's gaze drifted back to her once more, and this time there was no trace of his earlier arrogance, only a thoughtful stillness, as if he were seeing not just her, but the broader truth she represented, that mastery does not always announce itself, that brilliance does not require recognition to exist, and that the most dangerous assumptions are often the ones we never question. A faint murmur moved through the crowd again, but it was different now. Not speculation, not amusement, but reflection, people reconsidering what they had witnessed, what they had believed only minutes before, and how quickly it had been undone. Victor finally stepped away from the table, not defeated in the way he might have once feared, but changed in a way he had not anticipated, and as he moved through the room, there was no need for applause, no need for acknowledgement, because the lesson had already been delivered, quietly, precisely, and completely. And near the far wall, Clara Whitmore continued her work, her presence steady, her movements simple, as if nothing had happened at all, yet everything had changed. And in that quiet contrast, the room held on to a truth that would linger long after the pieces were cleared and the lights dimmed, that sometimes the person you overlook is the one who understands the game better than anyone else, and that realization, once seen, cannot be unseen. Long after the initial shock had settled into quiet reflection, the energy in the grand hall shifted once more, not back to what it had been before, but into something more thoughtful, more restrained, as if everyone present had become aware of how easily perception could betray them. Small conversations resumed in low tones, but even those felt different now, measured and careful. As though each word carried the weight of what they had just witnessed, Victor Langston stood near the edge of the chess table, no longer the center of attention, yet not ignored either. People glanced at him with a new kind of curiosity, not questioning his skill, but reconsidering the certainty they had once attached to it. And Victor himself did not resist that shift. He accepted it quietly, his posture relaxed but grounded, as if the need to prove something had been replaced by the need to understand something deeper. His gaze moved across the room again, not searching this time, simply observing, and, inevitably, it returned to Clara Whitmore, who continued her work with the same steady rhythm. Wiping down a polished surface near the far wall, her movements precise, efficient, almost invisible once more. Yet now, every small action carried a presence that could not be overlooked. A few guests approached her cautiously, their expressions respectful, uncertain of how to bridge the gap between what they had assumed and what they now knew. One man, dressed in an expensive suit, hesitated before speaking, his voice low, almost apologetic as he asked if she played often. Clara paused briefly, considering the question, then gave a simple answer. Sometimes, nothing more, no elaboration, no attempt to reshape the narrative around her. And that simplicity seemed to disarm them more than any explanation could have. Because it refused to fit into the dramatic story they were trying to construct, it did not confirm their assumptions or satisfy their curiosity. It simply existed as it was, honest and complete. The man nodded slowly, unsure of what to say next, and stepped back, leaving her to continue her work. And in that brief interaction, something subtle but important became clear to those watching. Clara was not interested in being seen differently. She was not seeking recognition or validation. She had not stepped forward to prove anything to anyone. She had simply responded to a moment. And now that the moment had passed, she had returned to herself without hesitation. Victor observed this quietly, and for the first time in a long while, he felt no need to step in, no need to direct the attention or reclaim the narrative. Instead, he allowed the moment to unfold on its own, recognizing that whatever had happened tonight was not something to control, but something to learn from. A few of the younger players gathered near the chessboard again, studying the position that had ended the match, their voices hushed but animated, tracing the moves, trying to understand how the outcome had been reached so quickly. One of them shook his head slightly, whispering that he would not have seen it even with more time, and another nodded in agreement, their admiration no longer directed solely at Victor, but now extended to someone they had not even considered before. And that shift, quiet as it was, marked a deeper change than any applause ever could. Victor finally stepped away from the table entirely, moving toward the exit of the hall, his pace unhurried, his expression thoughtful, and as he passed through the room, a few people made way for him, not out of deference, but out of respect for the moment he had shared with all of them, a moment that had altered more than just the outcome of a game. Near the door, he paused for a brief second, glancing back one last time, not at the board, not at the crowd, but at Clara Whitmore, who had already returned fully to her quiet work, her presence once again blending into the background. And yet, to Victor, and to many others in that room, she would never be invisible again, and in that realization, there was no need for words, because some lessons are not meant to be spoken, only remembered. And as the lights of the hall continued to glow softly against polished marble and quiet conversations resumed in careful tones, the truth of the evening remained, steady and undeniable, that mastery does not demand attention, it reveals itself, and once it does, the way you see the world can never quite return to what it was before. The night did not end with applause, and that was what made it unforgettable, because as the final guests began to leave the grand hall, their footsteps soft against the marble floors, there was no loud celebration, no dramatic conclusion, only a quiet, lingering awareness that something meaningful had taken place, something that would follow them long after they stepped outside into the cool city air. Victor Langston stood just beyond the entrance now, his figure framed by the tall glass doors, looking out at the streets of Manhattan glowing under distant lights, his reflection faintly visible beside him. But it was not the reflection of the man who had walked in earlier that evening. There was something different now, something more grounded, more aware, as if a layer of certainty had been gently removed, leaving behind something more honest. He adjusted his jacket slightly, a habitual motion, but even that felt slower, more deliberate, as though he were no longer in a hurry to define himself by what others expected. Behind him, the hall continued to settle into stillness, staff quietly resetting tables, collecting glasses, restoring the space to its original order, and among them, Clara Whitmore moved with the same calm precision as always, her presence once again blending into the rhythm of the room. Yet now, even in that simplicity, there was a quiet strength that could not be ignored. A few remaining guests glanced at her as they passed, not staring, not interrupting, but acknowledging her with small nods, subtle gestures that carried more meaning than any words could have, because respect, once earned in truth, does not need to be announced. Victor turned back briefly, his eyes finding her one last time, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, and though he did not approach again, did not speak, the moment between them remained complete, nothing left unfinished, nothing left unsaid, because the lesson had already been delivered in the only way that truly matters, through action, through presence, through a quiet certainty that does not ask for validation. Clara finished her task and paused for just a second, her gaze lifting slightly, not toward the crowd, not toward the board that had already been cleared, but simply toward the space around her, as if acknowledging something unseen, something understood on a level deeper than explanation. And then, just as naturally, she continued, stepping back into the quiet rhythm of her work, unchanged, unaffected, and that was what stayed with those who had witnessed it. Not just the moves on the board, not just the silence that followed, but the way she carried herself afterward, without pride, without announcement, without the need to prove anything further. Outside, the city moved as it always did, cars passing, lights shifting, people continuing with their lives, unaware that inside that hall, something simple yet profound had unfolded, a reminder that brilliance does not always arrive with recognition, that mastery does not need an audience to exist, and that the assumptions we carry so easily can be undone in a matter of moments. Victor stepped out into the night, the door closing softly behind him, and for once, he did not replay the match in search of mistakes, did not look for ways to reclaim control, because this was not a loss to correct, it was a truth to carry forward. And somewhere behind those closed doors, Clara Whitmore continued her work, just as she had before, just as she always would, not defined by what others saw, but grounded in what she already knew. And that quiet confidence, that unshaken sense of self, was the most powerful move of all, the kind that does not end a game, but changes the way it is played forever. Respect often reveals itself when you least expect it. If you enjoy stories that uncover truth, dignity, and hidden strength, don't forget to like and subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching.